Sabbath Triumphant. Let's go back and try to finish that chapter 2 of Montreal by Night. Sabbath Triumphant. With the British loss of the American colonies, many loyalist mortals who were still loyal to Britain fled to Canada. They settled primarily around the Great Lakes and in the eastern townships. This influx of British subjects demanded that Canada be divided into two separate entities known as Upper and Lower Canada. With Montreal as part of the latter, this immediately created friction as government representation between the two regions was to be equal, but the actual population count gave Lower Canada a 14-1 advantage over Upper Canada. To make matters worse, 500,000 French Canadians were underrepresented in government and were paid salaries close to half of those received by their English counterpart, whose population numbered only 75,000. Oh well, surprise, surprise. With tensions nearing the breaking point, the two factions each took their political corners in one of the Fils de la Liberté, which represented the French, while British honor was upheld by the Loyalists and the secretive Doric Club. In a fateful rally that began the actual 1837-1838 rebellions, the two groups came face to face and a riot was barely averted. Later, Governor General Gosford ordered the arrest of Les Patriotes in an effort to quash the fledgling movement, but only succeeded in strengthening its opposition resolve. A full-fledged revolt followed. Martial law was declared in Montreal, and by April 58 patriots were exiled and another 12 were executed. Later, another 64 were shipped off to the penal colony of Australia, and 10 more were put to the gallows. The British minority retained control of Montreal. Thraskana's decoy was a complete success. The primogenies of Montreal were aware that something was amiss with their prince, but believed it had more to do with the liberal stance toward the French majority than with his actual Sabbath ties. Mithras, the then true Prince of London, sanctioned Montreal's primogeniture to remove Thraskana from power, but advised them to move slowly, lest they make a martyr of him amongst his French supporters. The primogeniture formed the Doric Club to facilitate their control over the already subservient Loyalists. In an attempt to discredit the Fils de la Liberté, the Doric Club tried to draw the rebel brothers into an armed conflict, hoping to pin the blame on the French and Thraskana. The primogeniture moved, however, without thinking of the repercussions of their actions. They had no inkling that the plot would be used as a cover. For a Sabbath offensive, the Camilla was caught completely unaware as the Sabbats themselves rioted. By the middle of December, most of the primogenites were dead or being tortured, and Montreal belonged to the Sabbat. No one outside North America became aware of these events until April, when the dust had settled. Yet Trascona, even with the support of the shepherds, only retained control of the city through monomancy, uh, duels with other contenders and by proving his dedication to the Sabbath by torturing former Camarilla allies. Despite allegations that the Sabbath takeover was accomplished through Camarilla tactics, Frascona was admired for his cunning. However, the former prince realized that taking Montreal was not enough. The Sabbath needed ammunition for the future, and the only thing that would impede the British Ventrue from counterattacking was disgrace. Since the Ventrue were already embroiled in a conflict with the Tremere of England, the loss of Montreal would make the clan a laughingstock. The Ventrue therefore did the only thing they could do to protect themselves. They covered up their loss, the abdiction of a clan prince, and the fact that they allowed their guard to drop, the very same error that they accused the Theodore of committing when that clan was in control of the region. Thraskona knew the Ventrue would break down. He also realized that because Montreal was still officially under Camarilla rule, the Ventrue could not attempt to retake it openly. Yet, the main advantage that Strathcona had over the Ventrue was that they still believed that Montreal's fall was motivated by French cultural pride. The Ventrue were completely oblivious to the fact that the French, just like the English, were chattel to be used as decoy and cannon fodder. As long as Trascona could hide his agenda behind the French Patriot movement, Ventrue efforts to restore control would fail. La Belle Époque. By the 1840s, Montreal had a population of 40,000 following the rebellions. Upper and Lower Canada were merged into a single territory, and Montreal was its capital. With the dredging of Lac Saint-Pierre, the city also ranked as one of the world's largest inland seaports. Trascona watched this with amusement as the Ventrue attempted to placate the French population with more benefit and greater leniency, although the British did their best to convince others that Montreal was secure. The fact remained that no Camarilla kindred were left on the island. Virtually everyone knew Montreal was under Sabbath control, but no one said anything for fear of Ventrue reprisal. The situation was a powder keg, and Strathcona held the match. When it was proposed that Montreal be named the capital of Canada, Strathcona convinced the Sabbath to play along. It would be the Camarilla's final lesson. Appreciating the irony of the situation, the shepherds lent their support to Trascona, who in turn lobbied for Montreal's eligibility. The Ventrue were in a bind. Since Montreal was the most prominent city in the colony of Canada, any attempt to lobby against Strathcona, a supposed Camarilla prince, would be met with suspicion. The minor efforts that were made to stop the application were insufficient, and Montreal became Canada's seat of power. While a few Ventrue black sheep were chosen by the British court to represent clan interests in the new capital, the assignment was nothing short of a death sentence. The last straw. Montreal's glory as the capital of the Canadian province proved short-lived. In the formative months of 1849, several bills were put before the Assembly. One proposed amnesty to those who participated in the rebellion and financial compensation to those who suffered during them. The English immediately registered their opposition, claiming that the bill rewarded the rebels for their treasonous act and made no distinction between loyalists and traitors. Despite the debate that resulted, the bill was ratified by Lord Elgin, who subsequently became the target of open hostility. Later that same evening, the Canadian Parliament building was set ablaze, destroying government's record and 22,000 volumes of various work. The next day, riots broke out and the capital was moved to Quebec City. The Ventrue were unsurprised by the events that unfolded in Montreal. They began to understand the rules of the game being played and realized it was time to withdraw. Strathcona controlled the island too well, and the Sabbath were too deeply entrenched to be easily removed. The Ventrue labeled the assembly riots, which had absolutely nothing to do with the Sabbath, as physical Sabbath invasion of the city. The accusation, allowed by the Ventrue to wash their hands of the situation, they dismissed their losses as attacked by a superior force and didn't have to admit to the reason of the city's prince. Fin de siècle. While wars were fought in distant land, Montreal enjoyed the relative quiet of the last decade of the 19th century. Of course, the island was subjected to fires, pestilence, flood, and the odd revolt. But these growing pains were part of Montreal's development. Montreal's growth was particularly evident in its technological gains. The Victoria Bridge, completed in 1860, was the first link between the island and the mainland. The St. Lawrence River was open to sea-going vessels. Additionally, the city gained its first electric streetlight in July of 1886. With Confederation in 1867, Canada was no longer a territory but a country. The Sulpicians, still the seigneur lord of the island, were responsible for helping to open at least 13 different schools. Sorry, I'm going through the transition, turning the pages, including a branch of University Laval. Montreal had become the largest city in Canada and had a population of 216,650 by the end of the century. Pretty precise. While the mortal populace went about trying to cope with flood, fires, and daily life in general, the Sabbath was involved in skirmishes with lycanthropes who weren't linked with the native tribe of the Montreal region. Irish Americans, fueled by the fervor of the American Civil War and their hatred for England, decided to invade Canada in 1866. This Fenian movement was named after the fabled Fianna warrior band of Ireland. While the matter was resolved at Cook's Corner with the death of 10 mortal Fenians, the Sabbath Covens of Montreal encountered the Irish Americans' werewolf counterpart. The skirmishes were fought and the Fenian werewolves proved to be potent adversaries. 2 werewolves were killed and the remaining 4 escaped after being severely wounded. The new century. The 20th century brought many changes to Montreal. In addition to civil unrest and various strikes, the early 1900s saw a demand for more liberal freedom. Much to the chagrin of chagrin, is that an English word? Anyway, much to the chagrin of various religious groups. A decade after the invention of the automobile, the new sport car racing was introduced to an enthusiastic Montreal crowd. Finally, the Wimetoscope, North of America's first movie house was opened. What is that? Les Voltigeurs departed from Montreal in the early 20th century. However, Montreal was still home to 20 Sabbats, including the newly arrived Orange Man Pack, named after a local group of thugs who harassed voters at the polling stations. Les Miserables, still going strong, the Widows, the Librarians, and the Shepherds, who were searching for a new leader. Beyond those Sky Knights, several nomadic packs also frequented the region. The Eucharist Congress. The paramount event of 1910 was the Eucharist Congress. It brought 40 Catholic cardinals, 100 bishops and archbishops, and over 400,000 pilgrims to Montreal. The Congress